when we meet children with dyslexia, we become quickly aware that dyslexia affects people in different ways. For some people, it can be quite mild. This is sometimes described as dyslexic tendencies. And within a class, sometimes a teacher might say, oh no, then they're not dyslexic because they're not very dyslexic. But even if you have mild dyslexia, it can be very frustrating. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, if you have severe dyslexia, it will have an effect on an impact on all the areas of your learning. And these difficulties don't necessarily become apparent straight away. And sometimes they're more evident than at other times. Coming back to our caveman, if we were in a class where all we had to do was play and all we had to do was create with bricks and models, then we wouldn't appear to be dyslexic. It's only when we're starting schools and people are putting constraints on us. They're asking us to complete literacy tasks, and they're asking us to follow a timetable and to be organised. When we move into that sort of situation, then we begin to see that some of these implications and some of these challenges straight away begin to impact on our children. And those with the most severe dyslexia are confronted with this straight away. School becomes more difficult as the reading loads that the children receive increase. As they move further up the school, greater demands are placed on them, greater expectation for independent study, greater expectation for being able to move through the reading scheme at a good pace, being able to express what we're reading, and being able to draw comparisons. If somebody's reading the text to the dyslexic child, they can do that, but they're expected to read it for themselves. How hard is that? And how despondent do you become when you see all your friends moving quickly through the reading scheme and you, well, please don't make me stay on that low level for a long time, because that's really, really discouraging. So quite often, just because we can't read a lot, it's just assumed that actually it's just because we haven't learnt to read. We know that one of the implications of dyslexia is that it's really hard to read a lot of reading. So a child with dyslexia is going to be really struggling in the classroom because they're asked to read a lot. The impact will increase as the reading is more effort. And so it's very hard for dyslexic children to read fluently and with automaticity. For dyslexic children, each word is often having to be reread as if it was a new word. So even if they read the word at the top of the page, by the time they get to the bottom of the page, they've forgotten what it is. So reading becomes a real task, really difficult, and a lot of effort. Another point when dyslexia might be picked up and when it begins to become more of an issue is when the transition takes place from primary school to secondary school. This can often highlight the difficulties not just with reading and writing, which may well have been picked up in primary school, but are often associated with a slower development or just a reading or writing difficulty. But the dyslexic activity parts about organisation and the memory of verbal information, as well as the increased written outputs and demands, really come to light when you go in high school. In a primary school, if we're honest, it's mostly the parents who pack the bag in the morning. It's mostly the parents who will check that their child has got their dinner and their PE kit and everything that they need. But when you move through to secondary school, those responsibilities start to become the responsibility of the child. Have they written in their homework? Can they read the homework they've written in? Do they remember to do their homework? Can they remember the order in which to do their homework? And so you see, once we move into high school, this organisational difficulties become far more difficult. So much better to start tackling the dyslexia as soon as possible down in the primary school, and so that by the time the child is into high school, these issues have been tackled and have been worked with for several years. Otherwise, when we get to high school, everything just becomes really confusing, and often before then. giving something to read just becomes overwhelming and just becomes all too much for the individual to cope with. And so we see from this picture how typical it would be of a child just to be sitting in class, head on their hands, struggling to think, what is this I'm reading? So let's look back at the checklists that you completed last time. Because what the checklist enabled you to do, I hope, and I hope above all that you found completing the checklist really useful. A couple of you responded back and said that actually you had found that really helpful and really useful. I always think that completing your checklists enables you to look at all aspects of dyslexia and takes away from just looking at those top 2 criteria of literacy and writing. And so it enables us to build up, as we said, that picture of the child. To start to build up a picture of the difficulties that child is having. But then to think about what do those difficulties actually mean for that child every day in the classroom. Because you see, I can say I'm having difficulty with literacy and reading. But what's it like to be that child sitting in the desk every day in the classroom? And when we talk about the implications of dyslexia, that's what we're meaning. That's what we're referring to. What it's like to be the child in the classroom every day with dyslexia. And the future seminars, what we're going to be thinking about is what can we as practitioners put in place to help that learner. But it's only really when we begin to understand what it's like for them in the classroom, what the implications of dyslexia are, that we can begin to think how we can address those difficulties. So, top of the list, implications of dyslexia in the classroom, literacy and reading. Some of our learners remain at that stage of retelling the story. They remain at that stage way beyond their peers have moved on. You, I'm sure, will remember, or those of you who are teaching at that stage, that the very first reading books that children are often given have no words in at all. And they're encouraged to retell the story, to create a story or to make up a story from pictures on a page. And that is the first building blocks, we would say, of reading. But for some children, they never really move beyond this. And they become so efficient at this that they appear to be reading. It always amazes me how quickly dyslexic children are able to learn a text. Or if they're reading with an adult, how quickly they're able to use echolalia to repeat what the adult has said. So they give very much the impression that they're reading the story, when actually they've memorized it, or they've memorized parts of it, or actually they're just copying the adult. And so for some children, they can slip through the net for longer than we would think for their reading difficulties because they've gained these very clever tricks of how to overcome the fact that they're struggling by using all sorts of their own strategies that they've put in place. And they may be able to retell a whole story, but sometimes it soon becomes clear that they're making no reference to text at all. But for quite a long time within school, children are presented with work and with books and stories and PowerPoints on the screen and all sorts of other things that are accompanied by a visual cue. And so children with dyslexia are quite able to use those visual cues to create their own story, to create their own understanding of the text that is before them. But imagine how hard it is then when you're presented with a page of text with no pictures. You can't then just make up the story from what you can see in front of you. So dyslexic children are really struggling in our classes with their reading difficulties, and I think that's something we'd all acknowledge. We'd acknowledge that throughout the day there are so many instances of when reading is necessary. It's not just in those literacy lessons. Almost no lesson takes place in school that doesn't need reading and writing. And that's becoming more so. as we use art and design and creativity, not just to make things and to draw things, but to assess and talk about our creative process in writing and reading. Similarly in PE, it's easy to move away just from the physical activities, but introduce the need to read exercise cards, comment on what you've done, write down what you've done. So reading and literacy are really fundamental, and it's very important when we're thinking about the strategies that we want to use to think about not just the obvious lessons, but to think about all the lessons in which reading and writing takes place and how we can support our dyslexia learner across the entire day, not just in their literacy or humanities lessons where it becomes obvious that they're going to need reading and writing. Similarly, quite a lot of children with dyslexia will continue to finger point. Some of them are doing that even by the time they get to secondary school. And this means inevitably that they're going to be very slow readers. They're labouring over every word. They're overthinking every word, and they haven't developed that automaticity that enables them to read fluently. And this means frequently they'll lose their place when they're reading, and woe betide the class where I'm reading around the group, because if I have dyslexia, I'm tracking quickly ahead to see which line's going to be mine. So we need to be really aware of that. Sometimes using a guideline or a ruler can be really helpful to help us with that. Some of our learners can read, but they're really slow. So our dyslexic learners in the classroom, we need to be looking at, are they reading slowly? Do they need more time to read? Can I identify whether or not my dyslexic learner is reading really slowly? And so maybe when I'm giving them out a text, everybody else has finished, but the dyslexic learner's only read the first quarter of the page. But because they don't want to be seen to be different, you're looking to see that everyone's finished, and they will show you that they have, but actually they haven't. This can be because they're having to hesitate and frequently hesitate over words. It may be because they're having to sound words out when they're reading, and it may be because they're rereading it to make sense. Because if you stop and check very often when you're reading, then you lose the flow and you lose the sense of what you are reading. Some dyslexic learners read too fast, and that always seems to me to be a slightly odd thing to see. But quite recently I did an assessment on a child that did exactly this. They were able to read some of the text, but were reading so fast that they missed out huge, great big sections. They didn't even realise they had done. They just carried on reading regardless of punctuation. And when I counted up how many mistakes they'd made in their reading, it was really hard because I realised that actually they'd missed out several sentences, but they'd finished it in time. And actually, they were able to answer quite a lot of comprehension questions. So don't be fooled by your dyslexic learner being a really fast reader, and that's definitely something to look out for. They may be reading too slowly, or not too slowly, but they may be reading slowly and so not finished at the same time as everybody else and therefore only read the first section. Or they may be reading really fast but missing out a lot of the work on the way. Or they may be reading inaccurately. Now sometimes this is caused by reading too fast. And I've used several headings here which I've taken from a reading assessment that I use quite often and that I use with miscue analysis. And I thought that would be quite a useful way to think about some of the difficulties that people have if they read too fast. These difficulties can occur if they read slowly as well, but they're more likely to make these mistakes if they're reading quickly. So, mispronunciations. Quite often, a child who's reading fast will make a mispronunciation within their reading, particularly when it's a multisyllabic word, and as they're getting more confident readers. And they'll also mispronounce things because they're trying to work them out, but they aren't able to synthesize them. So watch out for mispronunciations of words. Sometimes the pupils will read it as if it's perfectly normal and perfectly okay. And so actually when they're reading it, you don't even notice. It's not until the comprehension stage you think they haven't understood because they've said a word that they didn't know. They're reading, they assumed that was the word. They didn't recognise that it wasn't something that they knew in their vocabulary. Okay, substitutions. You're reading too fast and you just change half the words to make them seem what you want to be. They quite often have plausible sense, like you might read and say, read cry instead of weep. So you've read the word, but in such a hurry that you haven't quite understood it. And again, as children get higher up the school and comprehension becomes increasingly important through reading, this becomes very important. So again, that's something to watch out for if you're looking for the implications on your dyslexic learner in the classroom of their reading difficulties. Have they misunderstood the text that they've been reading, not because they have poor comprehension, but because they've substituted some words or because they've mispronounced a word that they didn't know, or they've guessed an unknown word. An example I've given you is surprise for sunrise, which within some sentences would make perfect sense, but quite clearly would change completely what the comprehension of that sentence, of that passage would be. And then reversals. Lots of reversing of words like saw, was, or putting letters in the wrong place, so stop for tops, or now and one. Lots of reversals are quite common with dyslexia. And I'm sure many of you have come across children who are reversing letters or reversing words. Is a similar thing that happens. So look out for that. Children who, when they're reading, reverse the order of the letters in order, and thereby create either, in this case, a real word, but it could be a nonsense word. If children recreate the letters to make a real word, they are less likely to pick up their own mistake. I've used these Uno cards. I just thought it was quite a nice visual example of and visual reminder of the different difficulties children might have. So I've used the omissions cards, the miss-go card, when children skim over parts of the reading, often because they're reading too fast, miss out whole sections, or lose their place in the text. Often they're in a hurry, maybe because they're in a hurry because they don't want to be seen to be being the last. And sometimes they'll put extra words in. So I saw the birds in the trees rather than I saw birds in trees. Particularly those small function words get slipped in and out to help with children who aren't confident and who are dyslexic readers. Okay, so that's just a summary of those difficulties that are likely to occur with dyslexic children and that we should be looking out for with our dyslexic readers, and we should be looking out for as a difficulty with them and an implication of dyslexia as they are reading. So when we're thinking of strategies to put in place to support their learning and to support their reading, we need to look back on what their difficulties are, what mistakes they're making. Obviously, if you've got a child who's making lots of reversals, then that's what you need to address, rather than if they're making substitutions or mispronunciations. So it's very important to look at their reading, to listen to them read, and to try and work out what their inconsistencies are.